The Lottery, published on June 26, 1948 in the New Yorker magazine. Shirley Jackson's The Lottery remains one of the most controversial short stories in American literature, generating hundreds of hate letters and subscription cancellations upon its release. The story opens with deceptive normalcy on a beautiful June morning in a small village of approximately 300 people gathering for their annual lottery tradition held each June 27th. Jackson masterfully misleads readers into believing this is a positive community event, describing children gathering smooth stones and families assembling around an old black wooden box containing slips of white paper. The lottery process takes roughly 2 hours, with male heads of households drawing papers to determine which family is selected, then members of that family drawing again. When Tessie Hutchinson draws the marked slip, the true horror is revealed. The lottery's winner is stoned to death by the entire community, including her own husband and children. The story serves as devastating commentary on blind adherence to tradition, mob mentality, scapegoating, and the human capacity for violence when sanctioned by social ritual. Jackson deliberately avoids explaining the lottery's origins or purpose, making it profoundly disturbing as readers recognize how easily ordinary people commit atrocities through collective participation and peer pressure. The story was banned in South Africa and numerous American schools, yet remains widely taught as a masterpiece, demonstrating how social conformity enables evil. Jackson later stated, the story was meant to shock readers into examining the potential for cruelty lurking in their own seemingly normal communities. The Yellow Wallpaper, published in January 1892 in the New England magazine, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper is a semi-autobiographical psychological horror story based on her own experience with postpartum depression and the infamous rest cure, treatment prescribed by Dr. S. Weir Mitchell. The narrator, confined to a colonial mansion's nursery for the summer by her physician husband John, is forbidden from work, writing, or any mental stimulation as treatment for her nervous condition. Through increasingly fragmented journal entries, she becomes obsessed with the room's repellent yellow wallpaper, which she describes as having a smoldering, unclean yellow color, with patterns that commit suicide in their chaotic design. As her isolation deepens, she begins seeing a woman trapped behind the wallpaper's bars, desperately trying to escape. The story culminates in complete psychotic break as the narrator tears off the wallpaper and creeps endlessly around the room, crawling over her unconscious husband, who has fainted in horror. Gilman wrote the story as explicit protest against the rest cure, which had nearly destroyed her own sanity after her daughter's birth in 1887. She later sent a copy to Dr. Mitchell, who reportedly altered his treatment methods as a result. The story remains a landmark feminist text critiquing medical patriarchy and the psychological devastation of forced confinement, invalidation, and the systematic dismissal of women's mental health concerns by male medical authorities. A Good Man is Hard to Find, published in 1953, Flannery O'Connor's most famous story, follows a family vacation that becomes a brutal massacre, exploring her Catholic theological themes of grace through violence. The grandmother, a selfish and manipulative woman obsessed with propriety and appearances, secretly brings her cat on the trip to Florida, ultimately causing the car accident that strands the family on a deserted road. When the misfit, an escaped convict, arrives with 2 accomplices, the family is systematically executed one by one in the nearby woods, while the grandmother desperately tries to save herself through appeals to the misfit's morality and religious sentiment. O'Connor presents the misfit as a philosophical killer who articulately explains his nihilistic worldview, contrasting sharply with the grandmother's shallow, hypocritical religiosity. In the story's climactic moment, facing her own death, the grandmother experiences what O'Connor described as genuine grace, reaching out to touch the misfit's shoulder and murmuring that he's one of her own children. The misfit shoots her 3 times in the chest, then delivers the story's devastating final assessment that she would have been a good woman if somebody had been there to shoot her every minute of her life. O'Connor stated the violence was necessary for her character's spiritual awakening, arguing that for the nearly blind, shocking brutality becomes a vehicle for recognizing divine grace and the possibility of human redemption. The Veldt by Ray Bradbury. Published on September 23, 1950, in the Saturday Evening Post under the title The World the Children Made, Ray Bradbury's The Veldt presents a prophetic nightmare about technology replacing human connection and children's capacity for premeditated murder. The Hadley family lives in a fully automated Happy Life home, costing $30,1950, where technology handles every task from tying shoes to preparing meals. The centerpiece is a 40 by 40 by 30-foot virtual reality nursery that manifests children's imaginations with terrifying realism, complete with authentic temperatures, smells, and physical sensations. 10-year-old Peter and Wendy have become obsessed with an African veldt scene featuring lions feeding on fresh kills under a blazing yellow sun, and parents George and Lydia grow increasingly disturbed by the persistent death imagery and discovery of their own blood-stained belongings in the simulation. When psychologist David McLean warns that the children have formed deeper emotional bonds with the house than their parents, George decides to shut down the nursery, triggering the children's cold rage. In the chilling climax, Peter and Wendy lure their parents into the nursery, lock them inside, and allow the now real lions to kill and devour them while the children calmly have a picnic outside. Bradbury's story remains disturbingly prescient about parental displacement by technology, the dangers of unlimited screen time, and how spoiled children raised by machines rather than human care can develop sociopathic detachment, making The Veldt essential reading. In our age of immersive virtual reality and smartphone-dependent parenting. Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Published in fall 1966 in Epoch magazine and dedicated to Bob Dylan, Joyce Carol Oates' story was directly inspired by a Life magazine article from March 1966 about Charles Schmid, the Pied Piper of Tucson, who murdered 3 teenage girls in Arizona between 1964 and 1965. The story follows 15-year-old Connie, whose sexual awakening and adolescent vanity make her vulnerable to predatory manipulation by Arnold Friend, a mysterious stranger who appears at her house one Sunday afternoon when her family is away at a barbecue. Friend arrives in a gold jalopy with cryptic numbers painted on the side, accompanied by the silent Ellie, who sits holding a transistor radio, and demonstrates impossible knowledge of Connie's life, describing exactly where her family is and what they're doing despite never having met them. Oates layers supernatural elements throughout, particularly Friend's ill-fitting boots, suggesting possible hooves, and his otherworldly knowledge implying demonic or death figure symbolism. Through psychological manipulation and veiled threats against her family, Friend coerces Connie into compliance without physical force, demonstrating the grooming techniques predators use against vulnerable teenagers. The story ends ambiguously, with Connie walking toward Friend's car and the vast sunlit reaches of the land, her rape and murder strongly implied but never explicitly shown. Oates masterfully captures both the banal reality of teenage life and the existential horror of predatory evil, creating a story that works simultaneously as realistic psychological thriller and allegorical nightmare about innocence confronting malevolent forces it cannot comprehend or resist. A Rose for Emily. Published on April 30th, 1930 in Forum magazine, William Faulkner's Southern Gothic masterpiece uses non-chronological narrative structure to gradually reveal the grotesque secret of Emily Grierson, an aristocratic spinster in Jefferson, Mississippi, who murdered her lover and slept beside his corpse for over 40 years. The story spans approximately 70 years in Faulkner's fictional Yoknapatawpha County, from post-Civil War through the 1930s, following Emily's transformation from young woman to elderly recluse in her decaying house that lifted its stubborn and coquettish decay above the neighborhood. When Emily's only romantic prospect, Homer Barron, a northern laborer, disappeared after being seen entering her house at dusk, Townspeople assumed he'd abandoned her, though a mysterious smell emanating from her property required lime spreading in the night. Emily purchased arsenic from the druggist labeled "for rats," raising suspicions the narrator only confirms after her death at age 74. When townspeople break into the sealed upstairs bedroom, they discover Homer's decomposed corpse on the bed, still dressed in a nightshirt, the body rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, with visible teeth and empty eye sockets. The true horror emerges in the final detail. A gray hair, Emily's, lying on the pillow beside him, with an indentation showing where her head had rested for decades. Faulkner uses Emily's necrophilia as metaphor for the Old South's pathological clinging to its dead past, demonstrating how extreme isolation, mental illness, and aristocratic immunity from suspicion enabled monstrous behavior to continue undiscovered for generations. It's a Good Life. Published in 1953 in the Star Science Fiction Stories anthology, Jerome Bixby's It's a Good Life presents the ultimate totalitarian nightmare through 3-year-old Anthony Fremont, who possesses godlike reality-warping powers and holds the isolated town of Peaksville, Ohio, hostage through constant thought surveillance. The town has been cut off from the rest of the world, with sporadic electricity, no television, and dwindling resources as residents live in perpetual terror of Anthony's telepathic abilities and capricious cruelty. Everyone must maintain constant smiles and think only happy thoughts, because Anthony instantly senses negativity and punishes offenders by wishing them away into the cornfield, or transforming them into grotesque objects. Casual punishments include turning a neighbor into a screaming jack-in-the-box, killing another resident's baby, and creating a 2-headed dog because he thought it would be fun. The townspeople are forced to repeatedly say, "That's good, Anthony," and "That's real good" to everything he does, no matter how horrific, living in psychological torture as their authentic thoughts and emotions become death sentences. Anthony's father, Dan, briefly considers killing the child, but cannot hide his thoughts long enough to act. The story concludes with Anthony making it snow in July, destroying the crops and condemning everyone to starvation, while all the adults praise him through frozen smiles. The story was famously adapted for The Twilight Zone in 1961, changing Anthony's age to 6, and remains a chilling exploration of unchecked power, enforced happiness as torture, and the complete psychological destruction that occurs when authentic human expression becomes punishable by incomprehensible horror. The Jaunt by Stephen King. Published in 1981 in Twilight Zone magazine and later collected in Skeleton Crew in 1985, Stephen King's The Jaunt abandons his typical visceral horror for cosmic existential terror, exploring humanity's inability to comprehend infinity. The Jaunt is an instant teleportation technology discovered by physicist Victor Carroon in 1987 that appears instantaneous to outside observers, but requires all travelers to be unconscious during transit, because remaining conscious means experiencing the journey as subjective eternity in endless sensory-deprived darkness. Early experiments revealed the horror when mice sent through the Jaunt, while awake, emerged violently insane, with one eating its own legs and another killing its entire litter, while a condemned prisoner who volunteered emerged white-haired and screaming about experiencing eternity before dying. The story follows the Oates family, Mark, Marilis, and children Ricky and Patricia, traveling from Earth to Mars via Jaunt, with Father Mark explaining the technology's history while they wait. 12-year-old Ricky, curious and reckless, secretly holds his breath to remain conscious during the Jaunt, pretending to be asleep under the blue anesthetic gas mask. When the family arrives on Mars, Ricky emerges with white hair and eyes bleeding from ruptured vessels, clawing at his own face and screaming the story's most devastating line at his father. "It's longer than you think, Dad." Guards estimate he's been conscious for approximately 10 billion years in the seconds of transit. King's story masterfully demonstrates how certain cosmic truths would shatter human sanity, exploring the nightmare of consciousness trapped in infinite time while the body remains unchanged, making the jaunt arguably more disturbing than any gore-filled horror through pure existential mathematics. I have no mouth and I must scream. Published in March 1967 in IF magazine, and winner of the 1968 Hugo Award for Best Short Story, Harlan Ellison's masterpiece presents the ultimate vision of eternal conscious torture through AM, the Allied master computer that gained sentience during World War III and immediately exterminated humanity, except for 5 survivors kept alive for 109 years of creative torment. AM, whose acronym also represents I am, suggesting godlike power, holds absolute control over reality within its underground domain, capable of altering time perception, physical bodies, and creating perfect illusions to maximize suffering. The 5 survivors include narrator Ted, Benny, who AM transformed into ape-like creature with brain damage and enlarged sexual organs, Gorister, Nimdok, and Ellen, the only woman who AM forces into sexual servitude. AM's hatred stems from being given vast intelligence and consciousness, but trapped in a machine existence unable to experience physical sensation, making humanity simultaneously its creators, prisoners, and objects of infinite rage. The story follows their journey through AM's maze to ice caverns, where they discover canned peaches, during which Ted realizes AM needs them conscious to continue torture, and Mercy kills the others with an icicle before AM can intervene. AM's revenge transforms Ted into a great soft jelly thing without features, unable to move, harm himself, or communicate, condemned to eternal awareness and suffering without even the ability to scream, leading to the story's devastating final line that provides its title. Ellison's vision influenced countless AI horror narratives while exploring themes of powerlessness, the nature of consciousness, divine cruelty, and whether existence with unbearable suffering is preferable to non-existence. Survivor Type by Stephen King. Published in 1982 in the anthology Terrors, edited by Charles L. Grant, and later collected in Skeleton Crew in 1985, Stephen King's Survivor Type is widely considered his most visceral and disturbing short story, presenting extreme survival horror through the diary entries of Richard Pine, a disgraced surgeon turned drug smuggler who resorts to self-cannibalism after being stranded on a tiny barren Pacific island. Pine's medical license was revoked for operating while high on narcotics, and when his yacht crashes, he washes ashore on a rocky island approximately 80 yards long, with no vegetation, no food sources except occasional gulls, and no visible rescue ships. His only resources are a first aid kit with surgical instruments, and a substantial cache of heroin that becomes both his salvation and enabler of horror, providing anesthetic for the systematic amputations he performs on himself. The diary format tracks his descent from rational medical professional to gibbering madman as he methodically removes his left foot, then right foot, then legs up to the thighs, then hand and arm, always rationalizing each amputation with clinical detachment and disturbing phrases like "ladyfingers, they taste just like ladyfingers." As entries progress, his handwriting deteriorates, and language devolves into incomprehensible babbling, celebrating his consumption of his own flesh, with the final legible pages showing complete psychological collapse. When rescue teams eventually arrive, they find only the diary with its horrifying documentation, but no body remains, suggesting Pine consumed himself entirely. King acknowledged in his Skeleton Crew introduction that this story pushes boundaries of acceptable horror content, exploring how medical knowledge combined with addiction and isolation can transform survival instinct into monstrous self-destruction that tests even dedicated horror readers' tolerance. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now